Senna, I was firstly felt privileged that my name would be associated with such a superstar. I'm not sure in everybody else out here who are racing fans, who are not racing fans, and who knows anything about him or who doesn't know anything. So I'm going to just give you a brief story. Unfortunately for me, I never ever got to meet the guy, but as I've spent most of my career driving race cars, and now in my later career running teams, I've been around this business for a long time, and I think about Ayrton Senna as a driver. He was the ultimate. When the tragic accident happened in 1994, there was so much more that actually happened that weekend that people are not aware of. And when you watch this movie tonight, you're gonna see a guy who was incredibly dedicated and focused on being the very best. And living in this world of motorsport, back in 1992, 1993, Ayrton was the first driver that really brought to the rest of the world that racing drivers are actually athletes, probably more so now than any other sports athlete because of the amount of G-forces and stuff that goes on to make these drivers what they are. He was firstly an incredibly religious person. His family was very important to him, and then it was all about motor racing. That particular weekend in 1994, people recognized that Ayrton had won world championships, and in 94 he signed a contract with Williams, which was ideally going to be the best partnership that motor racing would ever see. But at the same time, there was this young Michael Schumacher that had come onto the scene, and that year, certainly before Ayrton was killed, it was only later found that Ayrton was quicker than Michael and everybody else in that year, in that short period of time, driving a car that was effectively competing against Michael Schumacher using traction control. And very late on in that year, people found that the car that Michael had been driving was using traction control. So it gives you some understanding of how good this guy was, because Michael Schumacher became a 7-time world champion. So having not been lucky enough to have met him, I worked with his engineer, David Brown, who had engineered Ayrton Senna, Nigel Mansell, Alain Prost, and all the greats, certainly in that era. And he came along and worked with my organization back in early 2000 with Cadillac, and I got to know him very well. And I asked him, I said, tell me about this man. And he said, having worked with Prost and all these other drivers, certainly the best that there ever was, he said there was never anybody that was more dedicated, more focused, and more hard on himself than Senna. If he was told that he needed to find a tenth of a second, he would find 2/10 of a second. If he needed to find a second, he'd find 2 seconds. He never ever feared being killed in a race car. It was everything to him in his life was being the very, very best. He also was incredibly hard on himself. And I remember watching him in Monte Carlo when he crashed leading. He didn't go back to the pit when he crashed. He walked straight back to his hotel because he was so pissed off that he actually made this mistake. But he was absolute perfection. So I'll bring forward to this movie when you see the build-up to this incident in 94. That weekend, people, I think, recognized that there was more to Ayrton than just being the fastest man in Formula One or the fastest man anywhere, as far as I was concerned, that he was a family man, and he cared deeply for his competitors, even though some of his competitors he would fight with, but he cared for them. And that weekend, Rubens Barrichello, another Brazilian driver, had an incident. Ayrton was the first one to leave the track and go to the hospital with him to make sure he was okay. And after that incident, he came back, and the next thing that happened that weekend was really a dreadful weekend in motorsport. Roland Ratzenberger got killed. And at the end of the session, at the end of that day, everybody left the track, and Ayrton was adamant that he wanted to go and see the car and see what happened. And, you know, this racing business is really, we live in a very small world. My teammate, partner, friend who runs my kids, Max Angelelli, happened to be the guy driving the pace car that weekend, and his father Vincenzo was the head of the FIA security that weekend, so you can imagine there was a lot of security that was going on, but Ayrton was adamant that he wanted to see the car. And he went down there, he had a look at the car, he came back, and there was only 4 people left at the track. It was Max, his father, and 2 Williams technicians. And the story was that he was crying uncontrollably, didn't know what to do, didn't know whether he was going to carry on or what he was going to do. That night, Dr. Sid Watkins, who looks after all the drivers in racing, said to him, Ayrton, this might be the time for you to retire. And I think the big question that motor racing has had about him was what was really going on in his head that weekend, because after that incident he decided to come back, and at the start-finish line there was an incident again, which were more helicopters, ambulances, and he was in a pretty bad way. And then unfortunately the accident happened, and so to this day, when people in our industry talk about who is the very best driver, they are still talking about Ayrton. And I think this movie really gives you a great perspective of who the person was. Thank you.